We're going to talk about influencers infiltrating fine dining restaurants, as well as places losing up to 13 million Norwegian kroner every year, as well as get into some stuff on Noma updates that have transpired since Ray and I recorded. This is the Repertoire Report on the Repertoire podcast. My name is Justin Khanna. I'm here with Ray DeLucci. How are you, man?
Good, man. How are you?
Good. We're just really going to backload, I think, the Noma news on this episode, mostly because I want to kind of give people, like, there's been a lot of new people coming to the channel. And I want to almost give those folks a taste of the other types of stories that we cover here on the show. And then mostly for congruency's sake, we want to kind of have a through line of some of these things that have been happening since we've been covering the Noma stuff. And that has certainly been like a broader industry conversation that really aligns with the mission at Repertoire. And so there's a lot of stuff there that I don't want to stop covering it. But at the same time, I think you and I have been pretty clear about the fact that, like, we don't exclusively want to be a Noma Reacts podcast. I don't know if you have any thoughts there before we get into this first story.
No, I think it's just, we think we've taken the approach where we've eventually covered the pop-up, then we covered the allegations, then we covered the response, and this is kind of going to be, right, this is what happened. Not necessarily putting a bow on it, but yeah, like you said, we don't want to, it's not meant for us to have a content carousel around Noma. A lot of this is really important, and it seems to be having a major effect on the industry. But we want to give takes that are meaningful and that actually are value added, not just trying to ring every episode as a Noma Reacts episode, like you said. So I think that's important to lay out.
Got it. So we'll start our first story. This is a article that came out in the Daily Mail out of the UK. And a subtext of it, and there's like a bunch of almost salacious drama in the headline of this, but a important subtext that I wanted to bring in the nuanced conversations we try to have on this show is how top chefs are fighting back against the plague of influencers ruining restaurants. And so, Ray, I don't know if you ended up reading this article. This literally came out this morning. There's a gentleman who is quoted in this article, runs a hospitality firm, I'm almost positive, and he shared it. And then I was like, oh, how did I miss this? Not understanding the fact that this literally came out a couple hours before we decided to record. The piece is really well done, kind of gets a bunch of insights from a bunch of different folks. And it thankfully does what we like to do on the show here, which is kind of like take a nuanced approach. And so I wanted to read a couple quotes here and almost get your thoughts on it. So it starts off by saying, quote, diners were being disturbed, food left to go cold, and staff prevented from doing their job. Quote, when politely asked to stop, the person that they're quoting, they would respond by saying, you ain't got a sign up. This is a public space. I can do what I like, end quote. He raises his eyebrows. I would explain that this is not a public place and the law treats it as my home, as licensee. We expect people to act with decorum and respect without needing a sign, end quote. And then this goes into another little tiff. After a few more run-ins, King had enough. This is the person they're quoting, and put up a sign. Filming, flash photography, and photo shoots are not permitted in bathrooms and all public areas. Discreet photos are welcome as long as the privacy of all staff members and fellow diners are respected. The story then went viral. King's many supporters applauded the move, saying enough is enough, and they just wanted to eat their lunch in peace. Others, mainly influencers, were outraged, saying that if they paid for the food, they had every right to do what they wanted, end quote. And so this is like a very polarizing, way to start the article, but I do think that it kind of touches on this idea that content and social media and people having access to being their own publishers online, as we talk about influencers, not just in fine dining, but how it applies to CPG brands. And when McDonald's launches a new, SKU or whatever, they're doing a collaboration, they really rely on social media to kind of spread the word on something like that through organic content, through influencers, through people who are genuine critics. Like, that's a real thing that I think we're seeing, where people who are at these institutions, the news doesn't actually break on the company's website. It breaks on the social media platform. And so I think that this is an interesting place to kind of like frame how things are going when rules are actually like society and culture is having to grapple with the fact that people are misbehaving. And because there wasn't any of these guardrails put in place, we're seeing people misbehave, and it's genuinely affecting the experience. I want to read a couple more quotes, but I don't know if you had any thoughts on that opening line.
Yeah, I think I remember covering a story very similar to this, where it was like people trying to solicit food. So then how could it actually be a review? I think, and I've never served at a restaurant where this guy's dined, but I think one of the people I see who seems to have a lot of access, and if you're getting that much access, you have to be somewhat respectful, I would think. Again, I don't know for a fact, but High Speed Dining, have you seen him on Instagram?
Yes.
And he's done a ton of, which I don't even know what that guy has done for a living, but the fact that he can afford so many restaurants, but like maybe that's the model where it seems very, he's trying in the moment, taking pictures and food. He made a video of himself, but then it's overlaying on top of that. But yeah, turning a dining room into your own production studio is very glaring. It's very dramatic and it can impact other people's dining. And I think one important aspect is maybe the staff doesn't want to be filmed in the light that you're sharing, or other customers want to be filmed. And again, not a lawyer on this topics, but yeah, I think that there is a line you can cross specifically in places like fine dining. And I don't think because you've paid X, Y, and Z money, you get to ruin the experience of others. And I think that's another big thing. If you have a whole camera setup and rig and someone else paid just as much money and they wanted to enjoy this for a dining experience and not eating for clout, then like you've ruined their experience as well. And like, do they not have the right to have a peaceful meal and enjoy it in the moment and not have flash photography and ring lights being set up near them? So yeah, I think it's an interesting epidemic we've come to find for the food influencer.
I think it just has poor ripple effects if you're going to use that as an excuse. Like, I paid for this meal, therefore I also have XYZ access privileges. I think that falls apart the second you like interrogate it with any sort of rigor. There's a couple other quotes I wanted to read here. So, quote, another influencer irritation is endless requests for, quote, collaborations, which means give us free food and we'll mention you on our social media channels. Chris De Silva, the man behind Notting Hill's Dorian, banned TikTok and Instagram influencers. Please, quote, social scumbags, he raged on Instagram. Kindly stop filling our DMs with unsolicited proposals for free food. You will automatically forfeit being able to come into the restaurant if you do. Hashtag instant blacklist. For any decent restaurateur, the paying customer always comes first. These requests irk even more in the current climate with restaurants collapsing daily, end quote. And so that I think is the other like side effect of all of this stuff is you have people who genuinely operate these as true collaborative businesses. I've given some of my friends who do this stuff like shout outs on the show before because it is like he literally judges his business on the text he gets from the owner the week following his content going out, which is, hey, how much business did this genuinely generate you? And typically with restaurant clients, because he has other people that he makes content for, he's not charging them that much. And so I think that there is this kind of like, there's a horrible, like transactional, icky, like one-way street way to do this, where you're just trying to like look cool on social media because for whatever reason, I don't want to psychoanalyze people. And then there are genuine examples of pieces of content that go so well on social media, highlight a place that is a hidden gem. I know, Ray, you've talked about this before, that it really tangibly makes an impact for them. And so I think that that's the line that people are trying to toe here. And I think with the overwhelmingness of it, and it almost from you're a hospitable person, right? Like if you run a restaurant or you're an operator in a restaurant, your nature is to almost be generous and kind of like say yes. You don't want to tell the guests no is a common thing that you'll hear in some of these environments. But then it gets to a point where it's just like, this is actually causing a detriment to our restaurant. And if that person is either not going to post about it, or I think we've seen other examples that us and other shows have called out before of people going to places, eating for free, and then turning it into a dunk on the restaurant because XYZ detail was off or XYZ thing was bad. And then they use that to almost like grow their following as opposed to be a active participant in the community. I don't know if you'd call it that, but like the ecosystem of, restaurants, chefs, diners, all of that. I don't know if you had thoughts on this, like asking for free food to quote unquote collaborate idea.
Yeah, really, really strange. I mean, I think that it was the road paved with well intentions where I could imagine when social media started, it seemed like a good deal for restaurants to be like, hey, we'll give you free food if you give us more exposure because social media is so apparent, but now it's just saturated. I used to do the food cooking blog, and if I wanted access to a place, the whole point was to highlight the chefs, and within that, you might not be sitting down, but you get to try food that they're making in the back, or you get to try products, and you actually get to do a deep dive. And it does seem like there's sometimes people that just want free food and want free access, and it to just be like more clout chasing for them. I think if you're trying to do food, I mean, like what you've done, like that, there's a very different. You could be a perfect example of someone who does this very respectfully and in a way that is really, showcasing the restaurant. And then there's people that just want both clout and free experiences. And like it's not okay. And especially for restaurants when the margins are so low, it's just a really bad quote unquote business practice for your personal brand.
Thank you for saying that. I would maybe like to add some context for people behind the scenes if it would help somebody who is like, hey, I'm thinking about producing content or, like maybe we're being a little bit too negative, like to maybe provide some alternative advice here. When I do my going out to eat videos on my main channel, which I haven't produced in a long time after becoming a dad, and we've kind of been homebodies ever since becoming parents, my wife and I, because her and I would normally, like, that's our leisure activity. That's how we spend disposable income, is like going on trips and eating. And the kind of policy I took after, similar to like yourself, Ray, I like had a food blog back in the day. I was thinking that that was going to be the format that it took because I was just very enamored with photography. And then I learned the video side. And what really worked from a format perspective for me was to keep the camera in a very like discreet way, whether that's like just the camera on its own, maybe on the hand strap or a strap that can kind of go on the chair. I don't do any lighting because I will default to using what are called fast lenses. So the aperture gets quite wide so it can perform relatively well in low light. And then I almost keep the recording going as the server is talking to the table about whatever dish that's being presented. And then I use that time to almost capture different angles of the dish. Again, no lights, no disruption, really trying to, in addition to produce content, like enjoy the meal myself. Because I think that if you don't do that, like what's the freaking point? And also I'm not adding any of my own like, like reactions on camera, which I think like some people really, really like that. And they build their brand off of, they are a duo that goes out to eat together, and that dynamic of seeing their facial reaction when somebody eats something. I don't have that in any of my content, and that's, maybe a criticism you can give of my stuff. When I made that the focus, because I had also, maybe you can argue because I spent time in restaurants, it added to this a little bit. But all the stuff that this article talks about, like needing to have a setup ready to go, like your food getting cold, like all of that just like would ruin the experience for me, and it almost like makes it not worth it in my mind. And so if you're thinking about considering doing that, or if maybe you're an operator who wants to like get some language from either the stuff that I'm sharing, Ray's sharing, or maybe this piece is sharing, that you want to institute as a policy to your restaurant to like make sure your team can perform at the level that you want it to perform at, that's the reason that I'm decided to kind of cover this stuff. So I have two more quick quotes and then we can kind of move on to the next thing. Quote, "That's not to say, though, that all influencers conform to the negative stereotype. Far from it. In a very competitive market, influencers can be incredibly helpful as a platform for advertising and marketing restaurants," says Adam Hyman, founder of Industry Bible Code Hospitality. So that was the person who I follow his company on Instagram. And so that when he shared this, that was kind of what I took away. And then lastly, quote, "To go back to the beginning, no restaurant should have to endure the rude and internally entitled. Jeremy King is quite right to put the comfort of his diners above those influencers who think that they can treat a restaurant like a film set. But if influencers can use their power to get more people eating out, I'm all for it," end quote. So they kind of frame it as like, well, there's good and bad to this situation. I think that I'm much more in the camp of very similar, to try to tie it into other stories we've covered on the show before, Ray, like encouraging operators to ask for what they need in the same way that I'll tell them that with their prices on their menu. And so if it's this uncomfortable situation where you're noticing like, man, week after week, we're losing money on this, menu item, I think out of fear that there's going to be backlash to some of this stuff by raising your prices, you won't raise your prices. And the same kind of applies here. It's like, well, 3-4 times a week, we're having these instances where our team is genuinely uncomfortable, or we're having to like have the manager go to the table and like really get into almost like a tiff with the guest who is quote unquote an influencer who's trying to do their thing. It's like, that actually can be something that you can put on the website. You can point to it as a policy. You can send it in your confirmation email to people. And the more communication that kind of comes around with something like this, some stuff like this, the better. Because unfortunately, it just turns into this permissive thing if we just let it continue to metastasize, so to speak. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on there from like, there's actually benefit to influencers, and then this idea that comfort of diners should go above those of influencers, especially maybe the obnoxious ones.
Definitely totally aligned on the comfort of your paying diners, especially over influencers. I think there's a fine line of like, you don't want to like chastise all people trying to give your restaurant free attention, but at the same time, there does need to be a limit on how it's approached in restaurants.
I think I came a little more heavy weighted on stories. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ray. Are we just going down my list today?
Yeah, we'll just go down the list.
Okay, cool. Because this is me paying you back for the solo episodes, so to speak. So thank you. So the next piece I picked out was from Tatler, this publication that did a piece from their Hong Kong Instagram. And the kind of question that they pose, or they kind of like include in this carousel that you can kind of swipe through, that we'll link in the show notes, is, quote, "an uncomfortable question about the state of fine dining. And this will kind of serve as a jumping off point into us kind of giving an update on the Noma situation. But they tied it in. They talked about Noma in the Instagram piece, but then they also talk about this restaurant called Iris, which is, quote, the immersive dining destination inside the Salmon Eye, floating in a Norwegian fjord, requiring a boat journey just to reach the table. The payoff, just 24 covers a night at Iris. The penalty, losses of 13 million kroner on revenue of 23 million, according to Norwegian media. End quote. So maybe we can start there on this idea that the business was literally not structured in a way that they could make money on this, like from the jump, like the way that everything is designed beautifully. And it's this, again, like it is almost becoming the meme of The Menu, the movie, for those that haven't seen that, where people have to, take this boat and, there's maybe not that many guests that are being served every single night. We're going to go into some of the implications of this. But I mean, hearing those numbers, Ray, I mean, like we typically cover stories of restaurants closing where it's like, it was like just not enough from a revenue perspective, or their profit was maybe just like not irking it out, or their lease was just a little bit too expensive, or food cost was a little bit too high. Same with labor cost. But this is like, holy cow, like this is not even close to profitable here. I don't know if you have thoughts.
That's basically 13 million Norwegian kroner equals 1.3 around million US dollars. I don't know, it's so hard to say. Wild. I mean, this might be a poor assumption, but this almost feels like, doesn't even feel like restaurant investors were a part of this. This feels like a startup investment into a restaurant, thinking that would be some giant like sphere level experience, not really understanding that margins are super tight. And especially if you're floating around on the Salmon Eye with only 24 covers, it's like the math probably never made sense. So I really don't understand. Like, I truly don't understand where they thought. Like, I would love to have someone a part of this project comment below if you have to be anonymous or out of embarrassment or whatnot. Just kind of explain how this was meant to be in any way profitable, or what the business decision was, how did we come to this? How do we get to this? This is, to your point, one of the many questions of like, how do we get to a restaurant like this where it's so exclusive, it's so high level fine dining, it's so experiential and like meant for people with a lot of income, and you don't have an understanding of how to actually make a profit. Like how, why, who decided, who greenlighted this Salmon Eye floating restaurant? I don't know. And again, not trying to dash anyone's dreams here, but we have to start having real conversations, especially with the Noma stuff, about how financials work in the restaurant industry and the food industry in general. And imagine all those people that work there that are out of a job, like that sucks. And that's because it wasn't planned right. It wasn't obviously thought out. So yeah, this will get me on a rant.
No, it's a good jumping off point. I want to maybe continue pulling on that thread. Like, let's jam for a second on this idea of like, there is the nitty gritty, get into the spreadsheet. The business is, bumping and booming and maybe not booming. And you literally have to look at this P&L that makes you depressed. But that's actually tangible numbers that you have the ability to look at and say, okay, if we tweak this, if we adjust this, if we cut this, if we increase that, you have the ability to make some changes inside of the business, which Ray, you and I have both talked about from a financial literacy, numerical, like advantage that you can have as a chef or an operator or somebody who's, at least in charge of either expenses or costs inside the business. But I think another skill that we can maybe highlight on the show here is this ability to almost like back of napkin math, which you're kind of touching on is like, maybe it was missing here. Maybe it was just like really poorly done. But I think all the way down to like when I was doing private chef stuff for people in their homes, and I would get a, email from a client, or somebody would reach out to me and say like, hey, I want to do XYZ thing for this many guests at this price point. And then the ability for you as a chef to sit there, this applies to so many other people, but like doing that back of napkin, just like almost estimations. It's like, we're seeing this all the way at the scale of like a 7-figure problem and failure, but this can also apply all the way down to kind of like knowing some of those simple calculations that you can have from the sense of get what you're going to, use from a cost perspective. And then the industry common thing is like multiply it by 4 because like 25% food cost. And then you can kind of like do some of that at least back of napkin stuff. So you're not signing yourself up for something that is like, oh my God, what did I say yes to? And I think when you're early on in your career, it's common for you to just, oh, this is an opportunity. Let me say yes to this. It's almost 2 skills. The first one is doing the back of napkin math. And then the second one is like doing it in a way that is not like just scraping the bottom of the barrel, including things, okay, well, if this covers my costs, what is the profit that I need to add on top of this? And I think we've talked about that on numerous occasions of make sure you're prioritizing that. Go look at your prices, because that is all downstream of some of these problems that we're talking about, or at least things that I've experienced when the organization is not doing well financially. And then all these other ripple effects kind of come from that. I don't know if you had any thoughts or tips on back of napkin stuff for folks.
No, and I think that not as much as that. I mean, I've managed food costs, I've managed costs now in what I do. But you look at, looking at Reddit, you look at the dining experience, it's closed. Like people are saying, After Alchemist is one of their favorite experiences. And again, this is a clear example of this doesn't mean the food was bad. Everything I'm reading, it has 5 stars on TripAdvisor. It is a experience. It's obvious the food was at another level. It was like an insanely high level of food. Nothing to do with poor food at all. It's more so the bones, the structure of how this business was made that is causing it to fail, whether it be keeping I don't even know, like I said, I don't even know how you get to that point where you're only seating, what, 30 people almost a night? Like, that's wild, and there's some reports on, they're saying they might do invite only, which makes it more of like the menu, I guess, but it's just like, at some point, it's like, what's the if this isn't a financial play, what is the play? Is it like that? Is it just the experience, that idea, a portfolio? And there's things that lose money, but then there shouldn't be a surprise when it closes. And this just gets back to the broader argument I have about fine dining, where I could see myself at 18 in college going, I would love to work on a floating restaurant where all you do is focus on food. But the reality is the concept itself isn't even a profitable one. And so it's just hard. When you see people going down a path for these types of restaurants, these very exclusive fine dining high end restaurants, it's like, wait, does this make sense for most people? Probably not. For the people that work there, love it, but you're also at the whims of stuff that's literally outside of your control. You are executing at the highest of levels, but the business execution is subpar at best. Not knowing why they lost so much money, but it's obvious the food wasn't the issue.
You teed me up beautifully for this next quote I want to cover. It says, quote, Iris is a case study in the perilous math of modern hospitality. Even with sky-high demand, a business model built on minimal seats and maximal overhead is a recipe for unsustainability, end quote. And so I want to pose the question to the listener, if this is something that you're, considering opening from an ambitious concept, or you're noticing that kind of like, oh man, this is kind of my business right now. We're maybe not doing so well financially. The piece lays out the elements that you can invert as you're thinking about maybe your concept that you're going to bring to life in the future. And so if they're saying minimal seats and maximal overhead, maybe you can not invert it completely where you're saying maximal seats, but you can almost replace it with the word practical. So like minimal seats has this super exclusive, we've covered these ideas on the show before, of like these Japanese restaurants in Japan, these counters in Japan where like you have to know the owner, or you have to know previous guests to get an invite to go do this thing. That works if you're, they include the other side of this coin, which is overhead. And so this is an example of both factors not being taken into account here. And this is when like the whole thing is built on a foundation that is just going to crack and crumble. And then the same thing with maximal overhead. Like everybody thinks that we talked about this idea of like in our our predictions episode, right? This idea of resources versus resourcefulness. And so it's this idea of if money is your hammer, you're looking for nails all over the place. It's like, how can we throw money at the problem? More, like the most expensive this, the biggest staff that, the highest quality ingredients this. And it turns into this problem where you're looking at this spreadsheet or, your invoices from your purveyors and you're like, this is absolutely unrealistic. And so almost as a closing point on the back of napkin stuff, I sit in coaching calls with chefs sometimes or I get DMs from folks who are trying to think about how they're going to price their pop-up, or they just got a thing from a client. And so often the back of napkin math includes the best case scenario, right? So you'll say, oh, we can do, let's just flip these numbers just really quickly. We can do 50 guests a day and we can do 5 nights a week. And so that's 250 guests. And it's like, dude, you are assuming that you are going to sell out every night, right? All of this stuff I'm just as big of an optimist as the next guy. But some of your back of napkin stuff is like, it is operating in this bubble. And so it's almost like you have to discount some of these things and say, okay, well, max we can do is 50 people. What's likely, we're probably going to have like a lighter Tuesday and Wednesday, then it's going to pick up on Thursday and Friday and Saturday, maybe we'll be sold out, right? At least for the, initial times of this stuff. And I'm glad that you mentioned the fact that like this business wasn't struggling, quote unquote. It's not like they, people would go to this experience and they would just like have a bad time. It seems from the piece that there was sky high demand on some of this stuff. But it's just more things to just consider as you're developing this skill of, I wish somebody would have told me this when I was doing some of this like pricing and putting together menus and trying to do costing stuff, especially like once I got on my own, because you can develop a lot of this wishful thinking stuff because you want to set yourself up for success. But then it's like the numbers don't actually play out at the end of the project. There's two other points that the carousel kind of brought up here. Quote, and this more pivots into not necessarily talking about Noma, but talking about more bigger picture fine dining stuff. So it says, quote, a dish isn't about flavor. It has to be photogenic, shareable, or viral. And I'm going to end quote there. Just kind of, this ties back into the influencer thing, talking about the pressures that fine dining and especially like R&D teams, these places that people travel from all over the world to come visit, they're also trying to, I think, make the argument that that expectation is almost a variable that in the age of social media and, there's going to be way more views of the meal that you post on the internet than there are going to be people that go and experience that meal. It's almost flips the incentives or the things that people are trying to prioritize. So I'll go back into the quote here. Quote, from architectural stunts to gravity-defying plating, restaurants are now de facto content studios, constantly under pressure to generate the next visual sensation or hot topic. And then there's another quote that it says, quote, the vicious cycle of hype, innovation, and burnout, the relentless chase for novelty, the more extreme the cuisine, the more intricate the story, the more dramatic the setting, demands ever greater investments in labor and R&D. When those investments aren't matched by revenue, restaurants get caught in a destructive feedback loop, end quote. And I think that's like one of the bigger things that we've tried to cover on the show here is like, I'm not going to discount anybody wanting to push boundaries or really try to go for it. I talked in the prediction episode of, earlier this year that I was hoping that we would see a team that like really goes for it. And then all of this Noma stuff that comes out about like, well, there's abuse associated with those environments. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about places where it's people want to show up and do really hard work and kind of like push towards a goal. And then if that's matched by revenue, that's 2 thumbs up. You know what I mean? That's performance. That is excellence. That is the stuff that I think is awesome about this industry that gets so many of us fired up about being, especially in kitchens that really go for it. Those are some of the most fulfilling experiences you can have in your career. But I think this piece specifically calls out how some of this stuff can be really, really detrimental. And I like how it specifically ties it into revenue. Okay, that dovetails nicely into giving an update on the Noma situation. And so I'm going to kind of change posture here. I know that I gave a lot of quotes in the previous stories. I mostly want to kind of like mirror other Noma coverage that we've done, mostly because there's been a lot that has happened since we, talked. I think it was something like 48 hours after our post that we made. It was this idea that René was stepping down from the restaurant. There's been a lot of questions on that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out some facts and we're going to link to some of this stuff in the show notes. And then I almost wanted to pose some questions to the audience and almost like maybe Ray, you and I can have a back and forth on some of these things that are like maybe a little bit left unsaid or they're, like allegations or, questionable things that maybe don't have so much bearing. But I think in the landscape of we've seen so many people come out and get involved in this conversation, both food writers and past and present guests of Noma, and then people who have worked there, both, past and present. I think that this is all, kind of like worth touching on. And I know that a lot of you folks enjoy hearing the way that we kind of cover this stuff. So the first fact that I maybe wanted to share with folks, the people who don't have social media who watch the show, thank you. Give us a shout out in the comments if that's you. But on March 12th, René Redzepi did a collab post with Noma that currently has, as of recording, there's 4.2 million views on this reel and 86,000 likes, and comments are actually off on this video, where he announced that he was going to be stepping away from day-to-day operations of Noma. There was like a, there's a lot of tearful faces that were captured. There was a lot of, like René saying things like, this is your restaurant now. But then there was other things that happened where he would say like, I'm going to focus on the next phase. I'm almost positive I'm quoting that word for word, but somebody can correct me in the comments here. And so there's a lot of confusion around this idea that, well, you're stepping away, but you're still going to be involved. And then he did an Instagram story that went along with it that I have screenshotted if anybody really wants to DM me and see it, or if you didn't get a chance to catch it. But he also announced that he was removing himself from the board of MAD, which I think is also, that's the organization that does all the workshops and the symposium and all of the other things related to hospitality as an industry and education. So that's kind of dot point fact number one. Secondly, talking about, again, like this is the other side of the argument, so the other side of the aisle, maybe. It's not to make it too political, but that's, this is very much so a versus situation here. Protests have started. And so we kind of touched in our last episode that we would touch on the protests beginning, and we don't technically have any outcomes of the protests yet from the sense of their list of demands being signed, and we'll go into some of those details here. So the protests have started, and Jason Ignacio White and others have gathered outside of the pop-up where Noma is currently serving guests with signage. They're chanting, there are speeches, and there are interviews that are happening with media outlets and other influencers, and they're making their own content that they're publishing. And so all of that together is currently what's happening. Folks, I tried to look. There was a list of demands that Jason had published, and then I saved the link here. And when I go to it, it says that the post is no longer there. It was effectively, and again, I'm summarizing. People can correct me in the comments. I can't source this directly, unfortunately, because it's a deleted post. But it is the situation where they wanted to have certain levels of transparency. They wanted to have certain financial things paid back to individuals. They wanted to have third-party audits that exist at Noma. And then it was a very, and again, Ray, you tell me how you kind of viewed some of this stuff. There was this posture of René needs to talk to us and sign these demands now or else, quote unquote. And then after the first day of the pop-up, when I don't know if it was clear that René was not going to come and talk to the protesters or what ended up happening behind the scenes, the list of demands was then updated to kind of increase in scope. And so I don't know if that included I know that Jason had partnered with an organization called One Fair Wage, and they had, quite a, big involvement from the sense of organizing, having people that were there. A lot of their logos are on some of the signage. And so it's unclear to me how these list of demands are changing and evolving over time, but they seem to be getting shared on Instagram. And as of us recording, there has not been any sort of meeting, conversation, signing, committing to anything there. Okay, thirdly, in almost like a rebuttal, we're kind of going back and forth there. So that was the Noma thing. Then we have a Jason thing. And now we have a Noma thing. I don't know, Ray, if you saw this. I think I sent this to you. There's now a workplace transparency review page on Noma's website. So this is noma.dk/workplace-transparency-review. And this basically goes through things like workplace practices, Noma Today, a bunch of different bullet points, independent workplace audits, how Noma in Los Angeles is kind of structured. And so I wanted to almost read off some of those things for Noma in LA. It says, quote, "This section outlines how we are supporting and expanding our team for Noma LA, including our 130 Noma Copenhagen employees and family members, along with over 24 local hires and a variety of community partnerships." And then it says, "In preparing for Noma LA, we began working with a team of well-respected fine dining, hospitality, legal, and regulatory compliance experts who have a deep understanding of how to operate under California and LA's rigorous restaurants compliance requirements. Working with Noma's own in-house HR lead, Noma implemented a system that is compliant with Danish and U.S. policies to support all of the employees who made the trip from Denmark and our U.S.-based employees who were hired to be a part of the Noma team." And then it says, "In addition to their standard compensation, healthcare, and benefits, each Copenhagen employee in LA is receiving free housing for employees and their families in the neighborhood near Noma LA, travel insurance, a monthly stipend for personal expenses, minimum of 2 free staff meals each day. This is also provided to our U.S. hires. A monthly cell phone stipend for each employee. This is also provided to our U.S. hires. Daycare or schooling for staff with young families." And then it also has underneath that, for clarity, in case anybody was curious, this is a situation where we have to kind of they're going to say it on the website. I hate that I have to caveat all this, but we've seen lying in the past from some of this behavior. And so without speaking to anybody, inside Noma or to confirm or deny this, there's a dot point that says no interns in LA. While we are proud of our internship program, none of our interns have made the trip to LA, and we do not have any interns working with us locally on this project, only full-time hires. All local hires have been brought on as full-time employees, end quote. And so there's a bunch of other stuff that you can read, really from a transparency perspective, going much further into things than how Noma has kind of done things in the past. And so that's another just fact that we're going to link in the description, and people can take a look at that and make from it what you will, make your own decisions there. And then the last fact that I just wanted to add in context here, because it has been this thing that I think not people are waiting for, but I think that similar to where I was sitting there and saying I wish you two would just talk. I wish René would just respond. Like I obviously this is ideal outcome of René and Jason both sitting down to one another, ideally in a public forum. Maybe there can be a moderator. Maybe it can be something that like, I don't know what format this should take, but like we are not aware of any conversations between Jason and René yet. And so this has very much so been Jason outside of the restaurant, peaceful protesting and posting on Instagram and other platforms between the Noma Abuse website and other outlets. Obviously, the interviews he's done with other media people. And then you have René, who is also posting on Instagram, making content, kind of, both of them semi working with New York Times in different capacities. And then René almost like doing this stuff on the internet and on the Noma website. And so those are the facts. I know that you wanted to specifically touch on the Noma video where René announces that he's quote unquote stepping down. And then I want to go into kind of like the other maybe hazier details of the Noma situation.
I do want to point out, because it's funny, this happened really quickly, but we didn't actually cover it in our last piece of coverage, is that Amex pulled their sponsorship out of this event, and like Noma started losing sponsors as well. And that so coincided with a lot of what was released. So it's like, again, my point's the financial issue. I was very disappointed in the video Noma put out. I thought it was a very poor decision. I think you share that sentiment. This video was it was filmed like it was like almost a documentary. It was filmed like it was almost like a movie. It was very strange camera angles, cutting to staff crying. Look, this falls on René. I'm sure there were issues within the organization elsewhere, but René is the person that bore the brunt of, the physical abuse, the bad business practice, how he treated people in the kitchen. And to have younger cooks and chefs kind of be highlighted as like empathetic to him, whether or not they were, I felt was kind of, just wasn't right. I feel like if René really wanted to own up to this in a way that was really meaningful, he would have just went face to camera and apologized. I think it was strange how he made almost a documentary style film, and it gave me this air of still they have not learned that it's like it was almost, and it had this while it was a quote unquote apology, it was almost had this vibe of like it's us against the world, like it's your restaurant now, whatever they're saying, like I'm leaving now, and it's like.
And he uses the words like he uses the word fight, like fight for this restaurant. You know what I mean? Like I need you to continue. You know what I mean? Like I'm going to go into some of my thoughts on this too.
And it's just that is such the wrong lesson and message to take away. And again, these people that are in this video, they're cooks, they're chefs, they're people working hard. I'm never going to disparage someone like that, but to kind of use them as a softening blow in your video, at least how I took it, was really not right. René should have just got in front of a camera way earlier than this and addressed, acknowledged, apologized, took next steps. And so to have it when all these people went to LA, and to have it when your financials are hurt, and then to still post a video that's so edited and done up, and like, I mean, I felt I was watching a chef's table behind the scenes scene. It just didn't feel, if it wasn't genuine, it didn't feel like they learned the right lessons. And beyond that, to your point with the transparency and stuff, you're only posting this now. People have been asking for this for quite some time. And this is, again, where I get frustrated with restaurants like this. If you are a legacy building restaurant, and I know that they made their fixes, and I know there's been comments about, and we'll get into some stuff on the site, but a lot of people have very critical allegations against them. A lot of people for many years had terrible experiences working for Noma. And so even if they started to fix it in 2022, 2023, there still was no acknowledgement of how awful of a place it was, but in terms of René's leadership. And it's like any institute, like you were at that point, you were an institution. And why you didn't have any of this beforehand is shocking. If people from multiple countries are coming to work for you for free and then for little pay, you should probably have built this all out beforehand. So again, just bad leadership, but the video just really angered me because again, and again, I'm not speaking for anyone in the video. And if forever the cooks or chefs in the video, if they felt like they want to be a part of it, I'm not going to take that away from them. But for me, I thought it should have just been René addressing it. And I don't like how line cooks and other people and the staff were kind of not put at the forefront, but included when it needed to be a message like that should have probably stayed internal. In the message he puts outward are to the many, 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 many people that sacrificed at the restaurant and left not okay. And so that was my one of many just issues with how they've handled this, even post acknowledgement.
Yeah, that last point I certainly agree with, and other points too. I almost get frustrated seeing, again, to bring this up, the lack of talking. Like the fact that, to your point, the public, internal, external, how this is appearing, PR, like worrying about it and deciding to fluff things up is maybe one thing. But it almost feels like because the way that they've decided to approach this or tackle this or respond to this. The thing that confused me, and I'm not the only person to kind of call some of this stuff out, but was, and I hate that I have to keep coming back to this, but it's the posture I have to take when we are observing somebody who is a history of lying. At the end of the video, towards the end of the video, René says something to the effect of like, I'm going to be working on the next phase, which basically negates his statement that he's stepping away from Noma. Like, you're divesting from, and I really want to be precise here. He says, I've resigned from the board of MAD. And then he says, all the headlines, every media outlet that decided to run with the story, which is like this, big bombshell thing of René Redzepi steps down as chef of Noma. I'm almost having deja vu with this, man. Like, I had this feeling with all these abuse stories that we covered years ago already. And I'm having the same feeling now because people are saying René Redzepi steps down from Noma. And we literally shared in the New York Times piece in 2023 when they said that they were closing, which I know was more of a journalist spin because it didn't end up happening. Maybe those were the plans and the plans changed. But talking about journalist spins, Julia Moskin, the person who did this other bombshell piece now in 2026, she writes about René and she says his role will be becoming closer to chief creative officer than chef. And obviously, Noma didn't end up closing. Caveat. But again, like, do you blame my trust issues with this, right? Like, he is saying, I'm stepping away from being the chef. I'm going to be chief creative officer. And now it's this, like, I'm the chef and I'm going to take a step down. It's like, well, I thought you already weren't the chef of Noma and you had other people in place to kind of do some of this stuff. So that was the first thing that is like confusing. René is still involved, but he's not. But, all of that, which kind of begs the question, who is in charge now? Like, previously, we had the ability to at least direct feedback at René. And because he was listed on the website, he's still listed on the website. If you go look at the time of us recording, he is co-owner, he is chef, founder, all three of those are listed. And he's sitting there holding a giant mushroom, and it's like, René's still on the website.
I had one of my friends, and it was in the video, and this is just a pessimistic view, but a funny view. It's like, he's saying, oh, cool, the restaurant is yours now. But so are they getting all like the profit
yes.
at the end of it? What is
very,
that?
Very valid question that I saw other people like post is like, okay, so from a business structure perspective, is the equity going somewhere else? You know what I mean? Because that's another thing that we covered in our iceberg video of, owners are taking dividends out of the business, meaning that they have some sort of articles of incorporation. I don't know exactly how it's structured at Noma and how Denmark does it with needing to report some of this stuff. But that's another thing that I think this video and this quote unquote apology, this, public display of whatever is completely negated if on next year's filing, René is still listed as a owner, which as far as we can see is like relatively public information. I think that is definitely something that almost follows along or rhymes with some of this behavior we've seen in the past of him almost, I'm calling this like saying the minimum amount to get people to kind of like, oh, look at him, he's saying the thing, like he's doing the apology thing, he's taking accountability, he's doing the stuff. But it's like not enough to actually like move the needle, so to speak. And that's the place where I get almost frustrated and I'm almost like, man, what a missed opportunity, dude. Because exactly what you're saying, could have had a conversation with some of these people, could have done a much more well-produced, genuine piece of content towards some of this stuff, but it just left a bad taste in so many people's mouths. And so, same thing with, he will be much more vocal about this idea of, I'm resigning from the board of MAD, but I'm just very confused here where to draw the lines and say what René is and is not doing. Didn't talk about Noma Projects. Is that its own separate entity? Is that what René is, quote unquote, the founder and owner of now? But, and exactly to your point, like, who has the leadership now? If something bad happens, in a week at Noma, is this a situation where none of us can point fingers at René now because he's no longer part of the organization? And then if that's the case, who is this person. And I'm not trying to say this from well, they need to, figure this out tomorrow. But I think that, to your point, Ray, this just feels messy. And it almost feels like, in the way that they've done this and almost tripped over their own feet on some of this stuff, it might make the situation worse. And that's what you and I don't want in the conversation of this from the conversations people are having, from the way that people are changing their tune, from the, increased, investigative visuals that people are putting on some of this stuff. There could be so much good that comes from this, and it feels like it's just like melting in front of our eyes and just being mishandled.
To your point of Noma trying to make quote unquote changes, and it seems like it still didn't work out, and they just didn't have that effort. And to only post this now when you've obviously had this past and you've tried to quote unquote reconcile it, and to not still become clean about it is very, very concerning.
I want to read 2 more posts, or kind of bring up 2 more topics in the spirit of trying to do what we do on the show, which is like maintain nuance, really report on things for you folks, and just give you as much information as possible. So this is a post from a gentleman named Paul Kaufman, and we'll link it below. He hasn't posted since November of 2025, so this is not something where like he's been reporting on Noma or whatever, but I thought it was an important public-facing thing to bring up. We haven't seen René comment on this, but apparently Jason has commented on this. We're going to pull that up in a second. So Paul says, quote, "Like many others, I've been following the recent conversation about Noma and the accusations being shared by Jason White. Seeing Jason present himself as a champion for a better and more humane kitchen culture has honestly been difficult to watch. The Jason I experienced during my time at Noma was very different from the person now speaking publicly. During my internship, Jason was one of the biggest sources of intimidation I witnessed. I remember many moments where I or other interns were blamed for completely absurd things. People were publicly accused of making mistakes they didn't make, and constant atmosphere of fear made speaking up dangerous. An intern who had been there before me actually reported Jason's behavior. After Jason got in trouble for it with Thomas Friebel and René Redzepi, their situation didn't improve. If anything, it got worse. Jason clearly felt betrayed, and for what I witnessed, that intern's life in that kitchen became extremely difficult afterwards. In his final week, the same intern was thrown out of the kitchen because Jason didn't like his quote-unquote mood. Earlier that morning, his girlfriend had broken up with him and he was clearly struggling, but instead of helping him, Jason kicked him out. What I find ironic is hearing Jason now talk about blacklisting practices at Noma. During my time, interns were threatened with exactly that. The message was clear: stay quiet or job opportunities would vanish, since he was so well connected in the industry. There are also stories Jason tells today that don't match what I witnessed. For example, the incident where a girl burned her face while opening an oven, a story where Jason claims chefs were laughing and he stepped in. The problem is that on that day, I was working with Jason in the lab, a space completely separated from the production kitchen. I struggle to understand how he could have witnessed the situation the way he now describes it. Kitchens everywhere need to change, but rewriting the past and turning yourself into the hero of the story doesn't help anymore." Jason comments, quote, "Hey, Paul, I am so terribly sorry if the environment in the lab or my intensity ever caused you to feel these things. I can also say that I am no hero or ever claimed to be a saint. I will not minimize anyone's experience. I hope that we can talk and find some closure or solutions. I would also like to say that the burn incident happened in 2022 after you left, and that day I was alone in the lab. I had to run all the way to the service kitchen after she ran alone to the restroom burned," end quote. And so it's unclear to me if there was multiple times that this happened, because I think that people are conflating, and Ray, you and I talked about this, we haven't heard from this woman who burned her face. And apparently there's multiple now. Like this is getting so tangled and unfortunate. And again, I'm again not trying to. Thankfully, Jason has responded to this in a way that it looks like he's not going to totally discredit any of these things. But I also think that it almost like zooming out and taking the bigger picture, like there was a really bad environment at Noma. Do you know what I mean? Like that, this almost like doubles down on that fact that the environment was really, really bad, regardless of, you know what I mean? It comes back to René, in this weird way. If we're really going to like talk about leadership and how that tone is often set from the top, it's really unfortunate that like this person is trying to come out and almost, not totally tear Jason down, just providing another context point on the whole situation. To me, it doesn't like solve the problem of like there's this really, really toxic negative environment that makes it a really difficult, place to just do your best work. I don't know if you have thoughts on this post. It is nice to have clarity on the situation that happened, because I think I've shared with you offline that it was frustrating to hear the burnt face story without any other context. You know what I mean? So now we know like an incident burned her face while opening an oven. And so like that, at least from a context point, adds more clarity to this, because you hear the words "burn your face off." That there's so, you and I have worked in kitchens. There's so many ways where that could happen. And again, I just, there's other notes here that we can talk about. I don't know if you have thoughts on this.
I don't know what he might have had issues with how he managed to. This all stems from the top. I'm not absolving him of that at all. Like, but regardless of if Jason even had issues, the broader point is that Noma was built on a within a toxic environment of free labor and abusive practices. And it's, so at the end of the day, that doesn't discredit the movement or disparage the movement. If there's issue with Jason, yeah, totally understand. But in all of this, there is a constant and a consistent, and that was Noma for a very long time, operated in a very poor and managed in a very toxic way. That I've seen people in the comments excuse it. Someone was like, "How are diamonds made with pressure?" And I'm just like, "There's you can simply say that something was managed poorly." And what some of the rebuttal was, "Oh, they're the best restaurant in the world." And what we just went back to with this fish eye or salmon eye restaurant, best restaurant in the world food wise, financially they couldn't do it. I mean, if you A had to rely on free labor and then B went, you couldn't like manage to keep your restaurant open, like that's how is that the best restaurant in the world? Like, it's best restaurant for some type of food creativity. But again, this is why I have a lot of issues. This is a whole other rant on why I have a lot of issues with these items, because it's like, wow, you can have really delicious food, but does that make you the best restaurant just simply because you have amazing food? Like, there's a lot that goes into feeding people, and just excelling at one of those things and nothing else is not always the best result. So
I probably should have included this when I made the transition from facts into these, but the specific ones on Paul's post, the René's involvement question that is very much still so up in the air, and then this last post that I'm going to make fall under this heading of non-verified. Because unfortunately, like, thankfully, Jason is getting involved in the comments in a way that René is not. But it seems like these are new reports, these are new allegations, as this story really, really, it gets global reach and kind of critical mass here. It's a lot of people are kind of coming out of the woodwork, which kind of leads me into my last point, which one of you folks DM'd us on Instagram, and I hope you won't mind. I'm not going to share identity. I'll keep things anonymous, but I did want to share a quote just in context, because I kind of mentioned this at the top of the episode because it was this relatively new thing on Instagram. In the beginning, Ray and I basically took this idea that it is so small. This is really stretching your neck out here. Those initial few, let's call it dozen stories that Jason was posting on Instagram, we basically took this as this is true. You know what I mean? We are not investigative people. We're not going to go do a deep dive. We're not lawyers. We're not going to go and interrogate these people to hook them up to a lie detector test and have you give that statement again. And one of you folks talked about this idea of questionable publishing now on the noma-abuse.com website, where claims have been submitted and they apparently get published without any verification. And so, again, just reading the quote from the comment, because it was this thing where we kind of mentioned it on our first episode that we kind of have to take these as true, but it might get to a place going forward where it's maybe not, and maybe we were not necessarily clear on that. But I really wanted to say this because I think this person seems to be very thoughtful that left us a comment. And also, I certainly agree with this take. So, quote, "I have no doubt that there are some real and serious claims, but I think it's fair to point out that one person is not an investigative journalist, lawyer, or detective. Yet he is cosplaying as one, and none of his practices hold up to the rigorous principles those professions use to verify information. Again, I'm not drawing any conclusions here, and I am in no way affiliated with Noma, but it's easy to see this kind of vigilante journalism detective work could ultimately hinder someone's ability to seek real retribution for legal and illegal harms done." And that's the last point, is the thing that I just want to echo and agree with, is the fact that when it gets clogged up with this misinformation, he said, she said, type of gunk in the story, in the tangle of things, it makes it so that the genuine occurrences that we're really trying to get to come to an end don't have the ability to get focus, because it's everybody's attention is being fragmented. And it's okay, well, look over here, there's this other thing, and I'm going to upload this because, again, from a verification perspective, this is where the lack of conversation also comes into play, where because we can't sit down with René, and because he will, deflect and lie and, spin the story or whatever, we don't have the ability to actually sit down, and he'll literally say things like, I don't remember all the details that happened with that situation. And so that's the place where like, I don't have an answer here. I'm just trying to like present what is currently out there. You folks obviously have the ability to make your own decision, but I think that I just want to bring all of this to your folks' attention because, again, in the context of the main goal, let's keep it the North Star in view here, which is like, this is an opportunity to better the industry. And let's continue towards that as opposed to, man, this is going to get me so much more, likes or followers or comments on whatever post that I just made.
Yeah, no, I think that's why I really appreciated Julia Moskin's reporting with the New York Times, because she has those resources. She's had the variability. And again, because if it comes out that something was shared that isn't necessarily true or was conflated, it doesn't take away from like the actual reporting from Times and everything else, like the real issues. But to your point, we do need to like make sure we're focused on the like whether it's abuse or whether it's unpaid labor. Those are the things we really need to tackle and actually see some results for. And I wonder what results, if any, are going to take place. I really don't know. And there's part of me that thinks it's just going to, unfortunately, we're going to be here 6 months later and he might not be a part of anything Noma goes on, but then he's still seeing the fruits of it. So I don't know. It's the what ifs of it all. But it's just, again, I've shared this a lot. For anyone, again, I just need to say this. For anyone in a food career, what should be most important to you is what you enjoy doing, how you enjoy doing it, and also there is a financial aspect to it that you can actually sustainably do what you're doing in a sustainable way. And I just really encourage people wherever you're there, like you said, there's good experiences to be had, but those experiences need to make sense for you. And so to tolerate a physical abuse, to tolerate no pay is not, in my opinion, a way you should go about your career. And this isn't like blaming anyone, but it's more so saying that this idea in the industry that that's all okay because it's in pursuit of a higher level of dining is stupid and needs to end. And we're never going to get there as an industry until we can just simply say we can't do that anymore. We can't just excuse bad or abusive or unpaid work because we're trying to hit some ethereal piece of food that is consumed in 2 minutes and gone. It doesn't work. So that's my last point on the Noma situation. I'm sure if there's larger updates in the future, we'll cover it, but I feel like we're just going to have to wait and see what happens with the industry now.
This is just going to be a perpetual thing of us not kicking this can down the road, Ray, but I think it's like every episode we're going to say like, well, this might be our last thing, and then something else is going to come out and we're going to cover it again. But I think that like we can't not cover this because it does the thing that we're trying to get it to do, which is like cause a behavior change ideally in individuals. And at the same time, like it clearly allows it's almost like it's a catalyst for conversation, right? So it's like, if we bring this up, people will we're trying to get more comments, but it's like, well, you were, maybe not talking about this, 6 months ago in a way that, you are now, or you're more open to discussing it, or you have the ability to have more of an open mind or change your perspective. All of that stuff I think is valuable. And that's the reason why we continue to harp on it, not necessarily because we're stands of any of the individuals involved. Okay. So
well, also, I just want to also clarify real quick is like I've seen, because we've done videos on Noma in the past, and I've seen some people, comment like I think you had some takes on why this might be better, and people getting upset about it. And it's like I think that just proves the point that we've always tried to be nuanced in our takes and try to really like look at what positives could happen within an industry that's imperfect. And so I would just say that like we are always going to try to look for the path forward that makes things more equitable, more sustainable. But then there's moments where like obviously Noma's broken and there's no denying that. And even if you want to try, if you're someone that's still sitting there like defending or understanding, it's like look at the evidence of people coming forward. Look at the evidence of sponsorships being pulled. Like that's all because of a very poor leadership problem. And whether or not you think that restaurants should be that way, it's not working for the vast majority of people in the industry. And so just being aware of that, I think, is important.
And that's why this is not a monologue, right? Like both Ray and I both give our perspectives here because we try to get some semblance of like level-headedness here. And Ray and I disagree on some stuff, but seeing that conversation play out is, in my opinion, better than what we're sometimes seeing with the people who are at the center of all of this, which is like silence, or I'm going to shut comments off, or we're not going to engage in conversation. Like, that doesn't help, unfortunately. And so that's what we're trying to also model here. Okay. So 3 quick hit stories, and then we're going to close things out and we'll wrap things up. So there was a story that I shared with you, Ray. This is a couple weeks ago, but we're finally getting around to covering it now. I don't know if you've been following. How much have you been up to date with like what Heston Blumenthal, the chef out of the UK, has been up to lately?
Not much. He came up with a personal story that I won't share. Nothing bad. It was just weird. I went out to dinner. He came up in a story. The next day, you bring him up. So Heston
Wow.
Blumenthal has somehow entered my atmosphere of
Wow.
news coverage and just personal anecdotes.
So, famed chef, he has a restaurant called Dinner. He opened this restaurant 16 years after the Fat Duck, I'm almost positive. Somebody can check my math on that. But he announced that it's closing. And so he said, why I'm closing my 2 Michelin starred restaurant. And the subtext for that, which might give an update for people who maybe haven't been up to date with Heston Blumenthal lately, says, quote, as he prepares to close his award-winning London restaurant, the chef talks about future plans and his life with bipolar disorder. And so for those who don't know, like Heston has really come out lately and talked about his own struggles and his health complications and things that he's kind of had to deal with over the years, and talking about environments that were maybe not the most conducive to being like great places to work. I think there's a lot of stuff that he almost like openly admits to now, which kind of ties into the conversation around all this stuff that we have been discussing with not just Noma but other restaurants too. It says, quote, there will be a celebratory 8-course tasting menu that spans 5 centuries of historic British food at dinner. The return of dishes from Dinner's culinary archive alongside classics and touch wood night after night of a fully booked restaurant. Then at the end of the month, exactly 16 years after the restaurant opened its doors in 2011, Dinner by Heston will shut permanently. No more chicken liver parfait disguised as fruit. No more instant liquid nitrogen ice cream made tableside. This time next year, one of Britain's most influential restaurants will have closed doors for good. And you might have the question, why? The closure coincides with the end of Dinner's tenancy at the Mandarin Oriental Knightsbridge and the luxury hotel on the fringes of Hyde Park that houses it. The contract was initially set up this summer. The contract was initially up this summer, but it was extended by mutual agreement for 6 months to celebrate the anniversary. And then Heston comments, he says, quote, I've got a year to wrap my head around it. There are some huge feelings there. Sadness, it's bittersweet, but it's run its natural course. We are effectively tenants in a building and our tenancy is finished, end quote. And so for those that aren't familiar with Dinner as a restaurant, it's, pretty iconic in Britain. The most famous dish that comes from that restaurant is this chicken liver parfait that looks like a mandarin orange. The article said this, quote, it took 3 cooks on the cold Lutter station 5 hours every day to make it. Within a year, they were serving 900 of these meat fruit a week. And according to his former executive chef, Ashley Palmer Watts, diners wouldn't eat the dish until they'd have had a picture taken with it. No surprise that in 2011, it was the most photographed dish on Instagram, end quote. And so I mostly wanted to bring this up in the context of, we're talking about restaurants that close for like these really unfortunate financial reasons. I'm not necessarily going to like dunk on this from the sense of, oh, well, this is poor business practices. This is something that is like, needed to have happened because this was unrealistic. This was clearly in certain seasons of its life, a successful restaurant. I don't know what it is like now. I mostly wanted to talk about this from the sense of what Heston has been open about going forward and his ability to kind of like touch on some of these things, be honest about his struggles, and maybe we'll link some other videos that he has been open to sharing in other media publications. I have eaten at Dinner. I had a wonderful experience there with my dad when we went on a trip to London several years back. This was probably almost 10 years ago. But it says, quote, Blumenthal will spend the next few months shuttling between the Fat Duck, London, and his new home in Provence, where he lives with Melanie, end quote. I don't know if you have thoughts.
I mean, it's good that, Chef Blumenthal recognizes that maybe he is not in the best spot to manage right now. And like, I think that more of that dialogue, and again, I'm not saying everyone that has has to deal with this stuff should come out and like have to tell everyone, but it is, I think, important to see a leader in kitchens and dining, especially at a Michelin level, kind of come out and be like, hey, I need to make this change because I personally can't manage that. So I just thought it was very interesting read. Again, I don't have much insight beyond I think it's commendable that he said that and that he's acknowledging that, and that maybe it opens up the dialogue for other chefs to be like, hey, maybe. And this goes back to we talked about the genius. I talked about the genius chef thing in my last episode. Like I'm not great at like I'm not great on the fly sometimes, and I'm really good, much better with planning. And it's acknowledging your strengths and weaknesses. And for so long, the industry has just put you into a box and that's it. And so I think it's really incredible that we're getting to a place where people are recognizing maybe I'm not the best at this type of position, but I can go elsewhere. So I think that's important.
We'll pivot really quickly. This is going to be super fast. Ray, I don't know if you remembered this story we covered from Travis Kalanick. He was the old founder, CEO of Uber, the company that famously transformed the kind of transportation, cab, mobile, rideshare industry. And we were talking about his robotics company that was really trying to get into this idea of like full end-to-end automation when it came to food, and how we touched in that conversation about how it might have ripple effects to grocery, and maybe it won't affect restaurants as much as all the doomers are talking about. And this week, Travis came out and he announced kind of like the bigger umbrella company for all of this stuff that he's been working on, which is called Atoms. And so the website is atoms.co, and we'll link it down in the description. I specifically wanted to call out this kind of subsection of Atoms, which is Atoms Food, which is infrastructure for better food. He's also digging into things like mining and transport. And so this is like a much grander vision than just like cloud kitchens, which I think a lot of people like labeled him as. And so he's kind of been going viral in his own way of, he went on TBPN and gave this, like really rah-rah entrepreneur, talking about pain and your ability to endure. And I think he, justifiably feels a little bit burned coming off of the whole thing that happened with Uber. And so the Atoms website kind of like lays out their vision, their plans for what he calls digitizing the physical world. And I'm saying this more so as a like look into how somebody is approaching the next, I can imagine, like season, to call it decade of building. But then as we're talking about this idea of, and we're going to kind of get into this in our next story, things like AI, things like robotics, I think all of this, until you kind of see it played out, till you have that like ChatGPT moment, or you have a task completed by AI that is, oh my goodness, that was really, really fast. It's like, I want everybody in the industry to like be aware of some of this stuff. There might be fantastic job opportunities at Atoms right now for the chef who's going to try to get involved in building some of this stuff. I'm not necessarily like going to be a doomer. I'm also not going to be a total like, oh my God, this is going to totally revolutionize everything and turn it into utopia. He talks about things like abundance on the website, which I think is like the thing that everybody really wants from an outcome perspective from some of this stuff. But I just wanted to more or less put this on your radar if you're somebody in food who is thinking about things like access and things like infrastructure and things like how all of these new technological innovations are going to culminate, and who's building that is a genuine question. And now we have somebody in Travis who is. I don't know if you have thoughts.
Oh, I'm interested to see where it goes. It's, the future of food is here and it's coming quick.
So that's robotics. I quickly want to touch on AI. Anthropic, the AI company, Claude is the app, and then they have different, language models inside of Claude. And they came out with a report called Labor Market Impacts of AI, a new measure and early evidence. And the thing that kind of went viral, at least in our industry, was this chart that they have, which is almost like a visual representation. It's a spider graph on all these different industries, and then almost like overlaid theoretical AI coverage and observed AI coverage. And the few industry sectors that are basically like, as you try to interpret this data, like least at risk of being taken over by AI, food and serving is like really, really low. Like it is like observed AI coverage is 0, right? And then food and serving is theoretical coverage is like maybe a little bit negligible. And then other things that are like, maybe not up for, risk of AI is agriculture, construction, installation and repair, production. And then the ones that are the most at risk is management, business and finance, computers and math, architecture and engineering, and legal. And so all of that stuff is just, I saw this kind of circulating because it was not a just total, like throw up your hands and say we won. But I think it is this funny thing where AI and automation, call it robotics, are two very different things. And I think if you were to kind of like flip this, it's almost like the chart, you know what I mean? Like the graph would almost invert and go the other way, where automation in a transportation sector is like, guys, full self-driving, like Optimus robots driving cars, like all of that stuff becomes a real conversation that we need to have. And so I'm not saying this maybe in the way that some of our peers are talking about it, Ray, when we're saying, oh my God, we're safe. In this age of AI, everybody's going to go to move to one of these other industries. I just think we have to maybe look at it from the sense of these are two separate technologies. They will overlap in Venn diagram in some ways. Obviously, I think you and I have also been talking about this idea of like, this is going to go slower than everybody is forecasting. But I don't know if you have thoughts when you saw this graph published, because I think you and I were texting about this when it first debuted.
Yeah, I have two predictions, or first analysis and prediction. So I thought the best way to analyze an AI report is to feed it back into AI.
Hell
So I
yeah.
fed it back into AI and I said, what is the AI? What does this mean for the food industry? Give me an honest perspective. So it goes on to say that food jobs are among the least exposed to AI. One of the clear signals in the report is that, like you said, there's literally essentially zero AI task coverage in food and beverage right now. It says that AI excels at text analysis and digital work, analysis and digital work, but food work is physical, sensory, focus, spatial, and it requires real-time coordination with other people. Typical restaurant tasks AI cannot do: cook proteins, plate dishes, manage timing of a service, taste and adjust seasonings, train line cooks, and handle food safety in real time. So, compared with jobs like a computer programmer, a customer service representative, or financial analysis, food workers are actually extremely protected, and kitchen jobs are structurally resistant to AI. The most exposed AI jobs opposite of food regarding AI are like we mentioned above. And so then I asked it to give me like a chart of like what's the AI risk for these jobs. And so physical cooking risk is very low, food prep very low, service interaction is low, hence your point with automation, recipe writing medium, menu planning medium, and then food marketing extremely high. And so AI, what AI can help with now in terms of food is recipe writing, menu descriptions, and nutritional analysis, supplier research, product ideation, marketing copy, and social media. And so the jobs in food that I think to be looking out for are the food writer, the recipe blogger, menu copywriters, food marketing analysts, some R&D capabilities, and the restaurant cook is actually very low compared to all those. So when it comes to something that I'm in, R&D chefs are a little bit more exposed than say the quote unquote restaurant worker. But my prediction is, and I covered a New York Times article on this, is there's going to be a wave of people coming into the food industry, whether it's through restaurants, whether it's through manufacturing, whether it's through R&D. I do expect with all these jobs being lost, or potential, if the potential of jobs being lost is this great, you're going to see an influx in the food industry. And I think that's why it's so important for you and I to cover the Noma topics, the topics of bettering the food world, because you're going to have a lot of people come in with this idea that the bear is how the food industry operates. Kitchen Confidential is how the industry still operates. Food Network is how it is. And I worry that that group of people coming in are not going to understand that like we've been dealing with and trying to fix these issues, and not to just accept that. So it's going to be very interesting. It's obviously going to be a very worrisome time for a lot of people. I'm very concerned. I feel a lot of empathy towards people that have to worry about this. And we might come back a year later and food is actually really exposed because of this technological advancement. So it's like always keeping your skills up to date, always being willing to try new things, because I really don't know how AI is going to shape the future. And it doesn't seem that there's any legislation protecting the worker right now, which is also very scary. So, all that to say, food seems relatively stable right now, but I do expect a large amount of the workforce to come into food if it's one of the few jobs not be impacted. And again, restaurants have always been, specifically, have always been a low barrier of entry for work, and so I just could see that becoming something where a lot of people come into the food world.
Dude, we're having to do like throwbacks to what we said 2 years ago on this show these days. And so I always want to like keep that in context because, we're going to be doing this, hopefully knocking on wood as I say this, like far into the future. And not because I'd like want this to like not age badly, but I also want to keep it in like the greater timeline of things. And again, similar to echoing what you said, like keeping people informed so that as these things progress and hit exponentials, the J curve really accelerates. We're making sure that everybody who listens to this show is as informed as possible. And
It's funny, I was listening to a podcast this morning, and the guy was talking about how farmers used to sow the seeds of their crops during different parts of seasonality. And I was just like, if you said this like 100 years ago, like this was some old time phenomenon, people would look at you like you were crazy. Like, what are you talking about? Like this old task where farmer, you know, there's obviously people that farm now, but it's so much more limited. It's just like this ideas of, and it was a correlation to AI and kind of task management and whatnot, or how like jobs would be, which I'm still very skeptical of, but it's just we're in such a different world. So
If you've been following along and you want to get some content on YouTube, we publish these episodes there with some visuals and some headlines and some links in the description. Obviously, the show notes on any podcast platform is going to be where you want to follow up or read more. And if you're in that show notes in the description, leave us a like, leave us a rating. That really, really helps the show to get into the feeds of more folks just like yourselves. Make sure that you're subscribed on whatever platform that is too, because Ray and I do these episodes all the time, especially on the YouTube side. We're making more and more content. We're going live more often and really trying to engage with you folks in more meaningful ways. If there's a question, if there's a comment that you want to share, like, we're always interested in hearing your folks' thoughts. And so please leave those for us, because we always love hearing from you folks. And we'll be back again next week for another episode of the Repertoire podcast. Thanks for listening.